Late stage brilliance from Aristotle in Book New, something we cannot say for Lionel Messi. Welcome everyone for the last time, fortunately and unfortunately, to the series on Aristotle's Metaphysics. You're joined here by Luca Teller and Alex Connor McLean yet again for the last time for the ultimate episode. I remember the inaugural episode with dewy eyes and a rose-tinted glow, and yeah, it's hard to believe that I asked Alex to join me on a voyage for what I estimated and promised would take 2 months. And here we are, 6 months later, still plowing along, still having as much fun.
Considering Odysseus's voyage took 10 years longer than what was planned, I think this is actually not too bad.
No, and this is far more great a feat as well. Talking about people doing rather than doing ourselves. We're also in the 1,000 club. We have too many subscribers to count on 100 hands. And so I'm over the moon. That's great. It's the beginning of many more things to come as well. But thank you to all those who have either been there from the start and watched every last drop of discussion, and then less of a thank you to people that joined along the way, but still you're esteemed as well. But you're not dishonest.
Yeah, this is actually taking off a little bit, isn't it? This whole channel thing you've got going. No, but like, congrats. That's actually awesome. Seems like there's a lot of momentum, a lot of wind in the sails now. And yeah, I'm excited to see where you go with this. I know we're here at the end of one series, but this is just the beginning for you, man.
This thing you've got going. Yeah, this thing that's like built to rival your deepest, darkest thoughts, right? About Kung Fu Panda. Yeah, no, plenty.
This lovely channel you've got here would be a shame if someone were to crush it.
Plenty in the pipelines. After the Aristotle series, we'll be getting deep into the literature world and the thinking world more pop culturally. We're also going to get deep into Hinduism, but would you like to say anything on that, Alex?
If you're like me and you want to know what's in Lucas pipes, smash like.
That's not very church-like, man. Yeah, well, you mentioned Odysseus. The Odyssey came out this week. I think this is just a news report channel. Like that's what my introductions are going to be now. Yeah, Argentina lost, the Odyssey released. And I guess this is a really fitting word because we dubbed it the philosophical categorical early on. And this is Aristotle's The Odyssey, right? This is his attempt to renew and attune to God. And so it's only fitting that the homonymous Odyssey released.
Yeah, I saw the Odyssey yesterday and thought it was spectacular. Thought James Cameron used the techniques that he's so good at in terms of linear time loops and different, spiraling effects for you as an audience to see. And that sometimes for movies like Tenet, for movies like Inception, that's what the movie revolves around, is like just all of this paradigmatic linear chronos time shifts and inversions, and that's what you're going to see. That is a content in a sense. The form is the content. But for this episode, I feel like Cameron stepped aside enough to let this myth shine forward, and then only used his techniques to further enhance that and bring it together. So I think if you're curious about what the homecoming of a king looks like, the sacrifice he has to make to come home, and how his homecoming isn't actually as good as what it seems, what does he have to lose to accept his own fate to come home, then go and watch it.
Yeah, paid promotions right at the beginning of this already. Also, Christopher Nolan, right? Or James Cameron?
Shit, Christopher Nolan, yeah, did I say Cameron? Yep.
James Cameron is the true GOAT, the guy who made Avatar and Titanic, and that's not going to be topped by some, prissy little guy named Christopher. And what else? What else is new in the world?
I think, what we're saying here is it's a Christmas miracle. The elated boys are back. Tell your mother you love her. It's a good day.
Amen. So this is much like a flame that flickers really vociferously, or voraciously rather, and most brightly just before it's about to die out. This is Aristotle in Book New. By my estimation, I felt like he was yeah, kind of like a last dance, if you will, chronologically, but also spiritually. I felt like he was getting ad hominem again at some points of this, especially in the second half. He was pretty passionate and enthused about it all, which I love. It's the thing I love most is when Aristotle transmutes into like a 12-year-old girl writing her Dear Diary. It's really palpable, and it just, yeah, it transmits nicely from the page to my eyes to my brain. So yeah, we kind of see his closing critiques in Book New. It's a bit repetitive, like we mentioned just before this. There's some rehashings of old arguments that he covered also in the puzzles that he questioned, and then in Book Mu and Gamma as well. It's his final reckoning. He talks a bit more about numbers. That's kind of the more repetitive part. We did a proper opus of a video on that last episode. So if you haven't seen that yet, check it out. Some really, really saucy stuff from the Delirious Boyos. He also talks about numbers again, but a bit differently as well, in an attempt, I would say, to pummel towards the adage I've really started to pick up, which is the journey towards the center of the earth, which seems to be the true course of metaphysics. And yeah, towards this mysterious and mystical the one that we're all just, what's the word? Like imprisoned by, enslaved to, but love our chains. We're bounded by the golden cage that might be the one. He ends up in Book New by invoking the good, which he talks at length about in other works of his. But he brings up here as well, and it almost feels like the ending of Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, where Wittgenstein becomes all mystical to end it off and says, we've solved nothing by solving everything. And whenever you kind of do this, yeah, Deus ex machina type move of sudden invasion, sudden intrusion of something that wasn't a part hitherto, then it's always that the timing of it is as amusing as the content of it, I would feel. So we'll also talk about the good a bit once the time feels ripe and opportune. I have a quote to start us off, but did you have any thoughts before that to set the scene as well?
Yeah, and what came to mind in what you were saying was how, yeah, these final chapters, and almost, this with this lingering afterglow of Aristotle, who has talked about the unmoved mover and is now going to talking about, the forms and the good, in this afterglow of that verticality that we've ascended to in the unmoved mover. And so with that, the thought that came to mind was how the unmoved mover is like the adjacent possible of when you construct and create a philosophical metaphysics. What happens when you explore the adjacent possible of the theos that's adjacent to the philosophy? So what happens when you do theology by creating new degrees of freedom and by seeing new dimensionality by moving into that space? So interesting to see where Aristotle gets with that. I'm definitely ready for this voyage. One final ride for the moment. Who knows if there will be a nostalgic reworking or episode to come in the future. We'll leave that hanging. But yeah, I'm just super excited for this. It's been 20 episodes in the making. There's been like so much that has been present, and I almost just feel that this episode's carrying us into its finish as it wants to be. We've generated and summoned and poured so much into this that now it's the spirit of this podcast's turn to guide us into the shores and dock the boats again. So yeah, happy to be here.
Very well put. Yeah, one of the most puzzling words that's used repeatedly, discursively, and multivalently in the history of philosophy is Geist. And another one that I love that is used as such is Soma, in very different contexts, but it feels like across the 20 episodes, my Soma, whatever that means, however you want to interpret it, has synchronized slowly with Aristotle down to the very style and mode of expression and locution that he utilizes, especially in the kind of the trailing chapters of Book New. I also like what you say about the adjacent possibilities. It's almost like having the necessary right modus operandi when we are, dealing with matters of theos. when you come from the world of philosophia, and then kind of like what we said about Hegel's system, where you just want to pick something up, play with it, but for the moment, externalize it or extricate it externally out of the system, do what you will with it, rigorously examine it scientifically, put it back in the system and let it swim back ashore, kind of thing. So yeah, I particularly like that. I'll get into the quote. It's a pretty lengthy one from the Gay Science. But the reason I picked this was because in the first half of Book New, Aristotle deliberates over the legitimacy and validity and usage of contraries, I would say. Obviously, the entire, endeavor and embarking of metaphysics is to answer the fundamental questions of existence. But one bifurcation that occurs straight away is: are we talking about what is fundamental in being or in becoming? Is there such a difference? Is that purely just a syntactic or semantic difference? What is the adverb becomes the prevailing question yet again. If you're talking about fundamentality in being, do you mean that metaphysically? Do you mean that genealogically? Do you mean that simply historically, biologically? And these are all very different. You could write a book about any of these sub-questions. So we know Nietzsche famously was seminal in the genealogical method as a methodology in philosophy, and how he kind of gave birth to that in his own quaint style. And I was thinking about how he traces origins contra the pummeling and the investigative nature of the kind of more, I want to say, like, straightforward manner of metaphysical investigation, the way Aristotle deals with things, to the center of the earth. I imagine a hypothetical dialogue where Aristotle might say that the development of our cognitive capacities is tracked well by Nietzsche, but this says nothing of fundamental nature of the world anyway. That says what it says, and it's a standalone discovery and study, but it doesn't answer. It kind of, by means of a means, deflects rather than it almost strays away, and easily strays away, and conveniently and expediently just answers the question of is it A or B by saying, I don't like your question, rather than saying A, B, or even saying C, just genuinely saying your question's dumb. So that's kind of, I want to do an AI generated philosophical cartoon series as well. So subscribe if that sounds like something that would whet your appetite. But yeah, so yeah, it just all, for me, it all comes down to adverbs. Do we mean something more truer, more ontologically? Do we mean something historically? Is that more truer? And in that vein, here goes the quote. How did logic come into existence in man's head? Certainly out of illogic, whose realm originally must have been immense. Innumerable beings who have made inferences in a way different from ours perished. For all that, their ways might have been truer. Those, for example, who did not know how to find often enough what is equal as regards to both nourishment and hostile animals. Those, in other words, who subsumed things too slowly and cautiously, were favored with a lesser probability of survival than those who guessed immediately upon encountering similitude that they must be equal. The dominant tendency, however, to treat as equal what is merely similar, an illogical tendency, for nothing is really equal, is what first created any basis for logic. In order that the concept of substance could originate which is indispensable for logic, although in the strictest sense nothing real corresponds to it, it was likely necessary that for a long time one did not see nor perceive the changes in things and in life. The beings that did not see so precisely had an advantage over those that saw everything, quote unquote, in flux. At bottom, every high degree of caution in making inferences and every skeptical tendency constitute a great danger for life. No living beings would have survived if the opposite tendency, namely to affirm rather than suspend judgment, to err and make up things rather than wait, to assent rather than negate, to pass judgment rather than be just, had not been bred to the point where it became extraordinarily strong. He then closes by saying, the course of logical ideas and inferences in our brain today corresponds to a process and a struggle among impulses that are, taken singly, very illogical and unjust. So his answer seems closer to the philosophy of becoming and legitimizing the validity of contraries as real and arising out of one another, but in a way that it isn't detached from a substrate, so they're interdependently tethered to a substratum from which they arise. And so there's a great degree of overlap with Aristotle's maybe not unmoved mover, but substance-based metaphysics somewhere there.
Absolutely. And I think what we find when we query into that substance is, again, this notion of activity and almost what you're saying, in that the adverbial quality of it is, okay, in its activity, how can we know it better? What does it suggest, given the fact that it is to be understood in its pure activity? Yeah, it's I think it's it's great to see that, even coming from Nietzsche, someone who can be very critical and very damning in certain ways, but here you see like where he is tethered to the tradition, where he is like commentating towards something that, yeah, even the historical development of it. I like what you're bringing forward about, yeah, when we're speaking about ultimacy, the kinds of words that are most true to how we speak about it. You know, are they the nouns or are they the adverbs? Is it the qualities that describe the way something moves, or is it the things themselves that are moved? And yeah, we know Aristotle tends to come down more in that the camp of the nouns, the things themselves are those substantial qualities. But yeah, I also want to definitely sort of unpick that, as we have been doing, and show that even within the tradition, there's maybe a fallacy of how Aristotle's been interpreted. And part of what we're doing with this series is re-enlivening the interpretation, which reads Aristotle in his truest sense, how he's meant to be read, rather than kept in the walls of the academia. And yeah, to kind of help show how even among the greatest of thinkers, you know, treat Aristotle differently and have much higher regard for him and deeper appreciation from his concept. I'll also go for a quote from Hegel in his lectures on the history of philosophy. If in modern times it has appeared new to define absolute essence as pure activity, we can see that this appearance of novelty arises from the ignorance of the Aristotelian concept. There is no higher idealism than this one. So he's viewing Aristotle in his own lens by saying there's no higher idealism, but Hegel would make the point that, yeah, that absolute movement that stems from the unmoved mover, like its own cause coming from its own essence. What we talked about how even characteristics of God are the existence is the essence, that for that entity that is God, that's where those spheres overlap. And Hegel would point to that and say there's no higher idealism than this one. And that's not to say there's nothing more in the idealist tradition. Like, nothing higher than this means he's giving very high praise to what Aristotle has been able to achieve in his concept, in his unmoved mover.
Yeah, I love that you bring up again existence as essence, because I always associate Hegel as almost a sub-philosopher of motion as well, just necessarily and concurrently running through the little bit of him that I've read secondarily. It seems that he also, near the end of his metaphysics, would repeatedly find ways to have an influx of physics concepts. And that's what we see in the second half of Book New from Aristotle as well. And yeah, notoriously influenced heavily by Aristotle, Hegel seems to have picked up some of those trails.
Absolutely. Well, no time like the present, and yet all good things must come to the end. So for one final ride on the old recap, so filtration system being the one phrase, sentence, thought summary on the episode 2 ago. So for episode 18, lambda, how are we going to write this down in a small paragraph? Well, the discussion on lambda was a discourse that divided into that dived into the untouchable, unmovable center of Aristotle's metaphysics, his unmoved mover. And we looked at what is at the center of Aristotle's universe, as you were talking about the journey to the center of the earth. The journey to the center is the spatial metaphor, but this is really that consolidation and the shedding of the untrue to reach the center that underpins the core of the life energy of the universe.
The unearthed,
So,
the center of the earth.
the unearthed. Well, how do you find the center of the earth? You unearth it. And so we looked at this concept and found analogies to natural laws that govern and move nature without themselves changing. Thinking about the law of gravity and the law of motion and quantum mechanics. And we also found that this source for Aristotle had a big influence on how he describes God, that this was his God. And it's kind of nearly fair to put it there. Of course, Aristotle wasn't a God-thinking person in the same capacity that later Christians were, but it's kind of fair to place it here as well because of the way that it influenced Christian thinkers later, through the likes of Thomas Aquinas. And we also found that a quality of this was that it doesn't need our attention for it to be upholded. There's some things that lack innate goods themselves, and so have to borrow and kind of be a parasite on goods, on our attention, on our own divine logos for it to sustain itself. Think about the things that if you turned away from them or put them down would just fall there and not have any real vibrancy or life. But if you turned away from the good, like the good still continues. It has its own center that's beyond us. It's empowering, energizing, and a coordinating source of life. So Aristotle's unmoved mover is the life beyond life.
I wasn't expecting you to stop there. Yeah, no,
I
that's
can,
really
I can cut into the next part if you want, or
no, I can say something. An undergirding spirit so far in the bulk of our discussion has been the presence of the devil, in a sense, and what is the Antichrist. And I quoted the movie The Usual Suspects in one of the earlier episodes where I said the greatest trick the devil pulled is to convince the world that he doesn't exist. But transfiguring of that is the greatest trick that the devil pulls, or successfully cons us with, is to make us think that something that's parasitic isn't, something that's devoid and bereft of innate goodness, as you put it, isn't the case, and so is like at bottom mendaciously deceptive. And that's a good working definition. I've seen a lot from Dante as well as to the nature of Lucifer.
Yeah, and think about how, like in the story of Red Riding Hood, it's the wolf that's put on this outfit to make out to be grandma, to be Red Riding Hood's grandma, when really that's just borrowing from a known identity and kind of symbolism, but without that is completely lacking.
And to borrow without having a bibliography at the bottom is the problem, right? And this is exactly it. When you, for example, zap soul and spirit out of something, and it's perfect that we're talking about Aristotle as the philosopher of fittedness. When you are unfit, or you are talking about something that doesn't couple tidily, neatly, healthily with the situation, then that's a good understanding of evil.
Yeah. And then moving into the recap for Mu. So in episode 19, we looked first at the tradition of comprehensive tuition that creates leaders and motivated self-learners. There were some nice reflections on that towards the start, which were, part of this beautifully wrapped up intro and recap, as they have been getting, where there's so much that is stemming from these conversations that we are kind of, want to get off our chest straight away when we begin. A little bit of, there was a quote that stuck out to me of the sort of one way to phrase it, I'm paraphrasing, is the cultivation of the unmoved mover of your unmoved movedness, is sort of what we are doing when we are becoming self-learners. It's generating that capacity for greater existence through actualization. And also, yeah, the important role of parentage in this, because we are not strictly, we're not confined to the realm of ideas. We're not confined to being armchair philosophers. We realize the dialectical determination of our lives, and so as we grow older and take on different roles, one of them as a parent, that's one of the areas that we can have influence on the next generation and inspire good habits, behaviors, and different intrinsic motivations. And that's a drama and a story that's played out in Kung Fu Panda. That's one way that we touched on that story again from yet another lens and another light. Something that was also cool that came through was the kind of reflections on what makes like the essential student. And it was kind of a small piece that we talked about, and how, and Aristotle must have been the greatest student of Plato's because he was the one who famously went against him and said he was wrong in a number of ways, and created his own philosophy. That is the essential student, is to overcome the teacher. And yeah, that gives the student their freedom to then go and seek new lands and new waters. And there's an essential thing, and kind of comes back to then that is how you also rescue the father or rescue your teacher, is to take them to an unfamiliar place and kind of reestablish them, plant the seed on a new shore.
And so much of that should be built into the teacher's curriculum or syllabus, if you will, right? Because you would expect your student to, at some stage, embark on what you can dub the spirit of adventure, and have some sort of innate capacity within your program that allows whatever your program is to be actively either put under a microscope and refuted if necessary, or at least subject to being disparaged, for the sake of strengthening your program, yourself as the arbiter of that program, and also your student. And whether they stick around or not you don't own them. Like, they're your student, and there's a finitude to that.
Yeah, and I think like wrapped into all of this, for me, definitely listening back and also in the moment, like a real warm feeling of like the desire to inspire and support and encourage students in that, given we, like me and you, have this shared story of becoming self-teachers and taking up our interests and our passions, which we didn't inherit from a familial area, but I guess that motivation that was nurtured to us does come to a degree from our upbringing. And so to give that gift on is something that almost just emotionally calls something from us, and that it calls something from us authentically, where it's we spontaneously have that desire, or like really want to understand how you can teach someone in that way, or how you can part ways with someone and give them that gift in the departure. And so there was not just all about like slicing and dicing and figuring out these truths, but also layered with this emotional warmth and receptivity, but yet desire to like support and encourage in that way. And part of that comes from reflecting on like ourselves as parents in the future.
Yeah, the ecology of practices that is supplemented and also supplements our eventual move towards autodidacts, as we said last time. And we also said, I think you'll get to it soon, but some sort of a supplement for you to become a self-starter. What's the thing that starts the self so you can be a self-starter? And if you don't have a ecosystem the way someone like Alexander the Great did and Marcus Aurelius did, then you need to find a way so you have your own ecology of practices that augments your learning and your growth and development and allows for the good life, human flourishing.
Shivers. No. Continuing with the episode then, we looked at Aristotle's take on the metaphysics of number. Plato has them quite high in in his ontology, he has them beyond this realm of the sensible and into this kind of area of forms that have a unique ontological placement in this vertical ascent towards, the one or the good. But Aristotle doesn't put them in that same camp. He says they're real, but he doesn't put them in he doesn't elevate them to a status that Plato does. So he doesn't leave them on the ground, but he doesn't put them in the sky either. And I think what we're getting to is more of this transjective view where maths are a real way to see into a truth. They do have these true properties and attributes that through abstraction can lead us to these deeper insights about reality. However, those deeper insights aren't taking us into this new space or new plane of discovery that has its own essentiality or substantiality. He's saying that it only gets that essence by being depending on this other thing that is life and earth and real physicality and real soul. That is actually what's substantial. So through its transjectivity, I guess, there's an interesting question there of, is he treating them as properly transjective and saying that it's through the coming together of this real world and our psyche through our own capacity of extraction as a rational being that creates the status of number, or whether they are simply predicated on what's real. But I think what we see from Aristotle is he's wanting to kind of say both. And so that would be more in that transjective space, which, as we saw, is where maths does go and needs to go to show us this non-dual way forward. We talked about the different kind of words that physicists are lacking to describe the phenomena that is right at the base of our reality. When we think to particles, atoms, and protons and electrons, a lot of the behavior at the lowest level of reality is a mix between a wave and a particle, these quantum states of uncertainty. And you can predict its position or you can predict its motion, but you can't predict both of them at the same time. You can only know one by not knowing the other. And so that's why they have these weird kind of togetherness properties that our comprehension is yet to catch up to. And so we need to invent constructs that capture and expand our comprehension just to harness a new understanding. It's an opening to a new kind of knowledge. And Neil deGrasse Tyson called it a wavicle.
Yeah, Mike Tyson's brother, as we established and found out. But no, on what you're saying, I really love that. I suppose that's why at the deepest layers of truth, not as veritas, we experience truth as disclosure, right? And it feels like disclosure because something else simultaneously is necessarily being shadowed or dissimulated, somehow concealed from us. Yeah, that's what was coming to mind as you said, this but not that, even all the way down to the uncertainty principle necessarily holding. I also wonder, I want to look into Heisenberg more in general, but I wonder if it's a law of non-contradiction type thing where it holds but for anomalous cases. So I'd love to just quizzically inquire about how physics really does tie into metaphysics, and maybe just starting by reading Aristotle's physics, then working my way down to more contemporary stuff. But then the mind does go berserk, you think, but then what about math? I want to learn about higher order mathematics too. But I also am a Taurus, and I do want to learn about what that means too.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, you've got your near term right there in front of you, should you take it up.
Dude, okay, just very quickly, like something I genuinely want to really get into, like second half of this year, is I forget what the science is called. It's not meteorology. It's studying the pathways and courses of river streams and why they change and what causes them to change and how that affects inland phenomena. I'm not sure if you know it. Maybe it's endology. Do you know what it is?
I don't.
But yeah, that just really struck my attention, and I thought, yeah, how am I just existing and I don't really know why a river flows the direction it does, the velocity, the the rapidity with which it does, the force, and like that's also, it's not constant, it changes. And why am I not intrigued as to why that changes? And yeah, it's just something that I need to know.
And I think, I mean, yeah, like that's, you should follow that, and you should study rivers, and you should know that when you're studying rivers, you're all about studying yourself there. Like you have this interest and passion for it. And to me, it was sparking thoughts of, oh yeah, those are like those attentional currencies, you know, those attentional economies that do change both ways. So when the universe flows one way versus the universe flows the other way and flows back into me, yeah, that's it. But it's so nice to have that coupled with just like a real science, and to almost allow those to blend together. I think if you're doing that, you'd be properly in the spirit of Goethe and his study of plants, and the leaf was a study of your own psychology as well. And so he would go through this meditation to understand the leaf and its different forms and its stages, and reflecting on the different stage of evolution of a plant and what its attributes are, what it can be used for, what it kind of connects within you, how you can see your soul within it. It would be, yeah, a proper study in that sense.
Please continue.
Yeah, so I thought there was a great point that you were making in the last episode, where the non-dual as a pathway or as a guide to understanding genuine reality. So when we get to these things like the Wavicle, or we get to an AB, something that we need both sides, and we need them together, but we also need them distinct enough not to just call it C. Like the Wavicle will only get taken up insofar as it really holds two things together. Just like, you know, the prayer really holds two together, but points to a vertical ascent, and that's the pathway to the non-dual, right? It's showing the unity in the distinction, and not just losing that unity, but also presencing the distinction as an important characteristic of it. And so it's through that we get this multivalent plurality, where it's not just, there's not one valence, there's not one meaning or effect that comes of a Wavicle, but it just holds them together and gets them very close, metaphysics of adjacency, but never just subsuming into the one. So that was great. That was fantastic. And when we looked and inquired more into, yeah, the nature of maths that Aristotle points to and that he sees, he thinks there's a derivative nature to mathematics, that they come ultimately from something that's prior in time, prior in substance, prior in ontological status, other substantial entities. So they're real, but they're kind of real abstractions in a way.
He's also comfortable with that juxtaposition just holding, right? I don't think he thinks that that's puzzling or something that needs to be reconciled. I think I get the sense Aristotle's okay with the idea of a real abstraction, just not reducing it to anything more basal than that. It's not real, it's not an abstraction, it's quite literally a conjoined term that exists.
And I think that is quite a mature view, and it's something that probably, yeah, sticks around even today. If you ask the physicists or mathematicians the ontological status, they would be, you know, not laughed away if they just referred to Aristotle and said, yeah, this guy said it best, we haven't said it better since, you know, he got to the truth of it. Yeah, I think you'd find some people like this, even in a field where it can be very platonic, and you can kind of think that you're finding different dimensions and realms that are, you know, causally linked, but that you kind of just discover their innate patterns. Even in a field like that, Aristotle does still reign supreme for some.
Well, he accounts for that in the first line of this entire book by saying, all men by desire nature to know. So he's talking about the stuffy 20th century people who are going to be reigning in on him soon.
And you flip the desire and the nature around them, but that was also a joke that we had going in the first one, where instead of all men by nature desire to know, all men by desire nature to know, and that's that Lacanian inversion of it. So
that's perfect.
It's worked out. In the spirit of wanting to see what Aristotle can be made to do, we looked at the discovery of imaginary numbers and placed some of that framing back into Aristotelian logic. And I was even thinking this concept, like when just in that moment, when I say Aristotelian logic, it's not about his law of non-contradiction, and it's not about like A equals A always. Like it's about the mode of thinking and the constructs used in the thinking, the system of thought, or the form that the thought takes place. That's what I mean by logic. And what was interesting to me was the way that calculus now becomes a new word that we can use here. So when we talk about Aristotle's calculus, it's again like that formalized set of kind of abstract principles by how we come to know things and how we come to do thinking. And so I thought that was a cool contribution by taking Aristotle into this sphere of calculus and just seeing them kind of merge and coalesce. And specifically, when we looked at the discovery of imaginary numbers, we looked at this figure who did the discovering. What was his name? Tartaglia. Niccolo Tartaglia, an Italian mathematician from the 16th century. And the story was very interesting, and so it was told, and it was about how back in the day you could be challenged by different mathematical teachers or budding students, and you did have to constantly defend your position as the greatest mathematician in that region, in that town, in that school. And so the discovery of it kind of came from a teacher who had discovered it but didn't share it so that he could keep this knowledge of solving cubic equations. And he ended up passing it to a student. One student tried to leverage that to undermine Tartaglia and assert his own dominance. And Tartaglia got wind of this and went to solving it, solved it himself, and then was able to defend his position. And so just becomes a hero and becomes someone that we're talking about 500 years later. The solve for the cubic equations was an irrational number. It was like a negative number to a square root. And so there was a contradiction that equations hadn't seen before. And what it meant was you had to later on invent these placeholders for that value, and to say that, okay, when we include this value, the equations work, things work out, and we can use it to predict and learn more things about the world. But that number in itself is a kind of paradox. It doesn't fit within Euclidean geometry. And what happens is when you go into that, you have to create a greater grasp of our geometrics. It's away from Euclid in these 2 and 3 dimensional planes and into this like 4 dimensionality where there's oscillations and rotations that go into a dimension that wasn't in there in the dimension before. And so through that invention, we have this, algebraization of number to this point of the unreal or imaginary, but we find truth in that unrealness, and it helps us to deepen and complexify and expand, but also create a greater account of things in the world. So to free ourselves, we had to free ourselves from our attachment to reality to get a better fit to our reality. So again, it's when we're holding on too tight and we're unable to think about zero and negative numbers and our equations can't equal negatives. Actually, when you give ourselves the tools and freedoms to do so, we can unlock what's deeper in that contradiction. Notice that it's not just about accepting negative numbers as our answer. It's about asking, why must we accept negative numbers for our answer? It's about going into that contradiction, like not just holding a contradiction, but exploring the creative tension that it produces and deepening that as a way to reveal more of the nature of what's there. And that's a perfectly Hegelian move. That's how the Hegelian dialectic operates. So yeah, it was a remarkable story and just really lovely to share it. And that was a wrap. And that is a wrap. Here we are.
Perfect. From high order mathematics and the realness or lack thereof of abstraction and our capacity to abstract, we can move into Book New and how Aristotle speaks of the difference between, I think he starts with manyness as a concept, what his take is on that, contraries, oneness versus manyness. So I had a few thoughts about the initial stages of these chapters. He basically talks about, he actually does start by still continuing to speak about number. He talks about the kind of misappropriation of number conceptually in the last lead into this. And he thinks that what this leads to is a manyness facade in matter. For him, matter is not that which is many, it's simply that which can receive form. That is like a working definitions of matter. Manyness for Aristotle isn't even a thing. It's a way that things can manily be, like it's a way that many things present themselves. It's almost like a possible state of affairs, but it's not that in its substance or in its core. I wrote down that he wrote that plurality is a ready-made determination. So yeah, it's just the same thing. Like it isn't a pure potentiality. It's something that has determination to begin with. He also repeatedly, both in this opening chapter and the ending salvo of Book Mu, repeatedly accuses the people in the academy for turning what he thinks are predicates into principles and making those things that are predicated first principles, as he polemically accuses and insinuates Plato and his folk do in the academy. But yeah, fundamentally, the takeaway idea was that for Aristotle, the thing itself is to be distinguished from the many ways that the thing can be intelligible, comprehended, and presented. So the manyness is the accidental properties in his terminology, and the thing, the way it actually is the essential property or closer to it. And I quote, "Suppose that one said that the white is a principle not qua something else, but qua white, but also said that, being white, it was a predicable entity and existed as something else. The point is that, quote unquote, something else must be prior to the white. But surely, if everything comes from contraries, the latter must be prior to the white." So yeah, there just has to be an attachment to any pair of opposites. If you say that reality and our experience of it is good versus evil on a backdrop of order and chaos, as the Lobster King would say, Aristotle would inquire over the subject. Like it's a battleground between good and evil. Good and evil what? People, feelings, sentiments, actions, events. It's not enough to say this abstraction on its own. Number is a real abstraction, meaning it has to be, where's the tethering part of it? And you can use it and it is real, but where's the tethering part of it, or the tethered part of it rather? So yeah, I guess rewording the quote a little bit about whiteness. For Aristotle, whiteness doesn't exist unless something exists that is white. And then by extension, whiteness does legitimately exist. So it's not hanging off and ultimately illusory or false. It's as real as the thing that it's parasitically attached to, I suppose. Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
I just have one thing to say: adverbs, adverbs, adverbs.
Right? Adverbs, metaphysics of disjunction, to be released in 2027. Once Lucatella hits 5 digits in his number of subscribers count. We're only on 4 so far.
And then if you start a publishing company, I will release a book through it as well.
To rival my book?
Yeah. I think, like, Luca, what are the qualities, what are the adverbs, I guess, to veritas as understanding of truth?
That's a good question. I'd have to think on it. I have no straightaway answer. Could you rephrase it?
Yeah, and maybe let's pause here on the episode, but I genuinely mean it, Cicera, and it's just the fact that you use it, and I'm pretty sure even like because I'm kind of, the move I have is comparing aletheia as truth revelation to veritas, but every time I search veritas, I can't get the clear picture. So I'm wondering from you and what you've read, like, yeah, what are the features of veritas as a truth mechanism?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say I use it interchangeably with the correspondence theory, but I think truth is veritas. I mean, veritas is a Latin word, right? And I'm associating it with the period from which it springs out and is embedded in firmly. And I would take veritas to be truth is that which is, I want to rephrase that. Truth in the form of veritas is when there's zero room for hermeneutics of suspicion. The veritas working definition of truth would be things are truly as they appear. So there's a fidelity, and that's what I mean by correspondence. There's a fidelity between the person making the representation and the represented. Some sort of like a bedrock faithfulness, fidelity, and honesty between something that's conceptual sometimes that's more affectual and pathic too. And there would be there's room for wiggle room within truth as veritas as well. It's not all mental representations and concepts. It's also in human behavior, psychological, and in the actions that transpire in our lives. But for example, truth as veritas as an umbrella framing as it pertains to a human behavior's actions would be something like always tell the truth no matter what. That would be a dictum by which you would operate under veritas. And that clearly that doesn't hold, right? When my as yet unborn daughter comes up to me and says, I look like Cinderella, right? I'm so beautiful. I'm not going to say, no, you don't. Cinderella was way more beautiful than you. But I would say that if I was operating under my working definition of veritas, if that answers your question.
Yeah, so it's closer to almost, showing truth with care. And some of that care is, I mean, when it's done through action, there's always that element of care introduced. But also, I was hearing that correspondence and almost representational. When there's an accordance, when there's a coordination between what's spoken and what is, you have this kind of understanding of veritas.
But almost like a clunky type of concordance, and accordance rather than concordance, perhaps.
Yeah, the accord, when it accords to something. It
accords, but there's no covenant there that's sacred,
Yeah. And I just bring it up, and this is potentially a pretty disjunctive comparison, but even thinking about like if veritas is the way that truth about nouns comes to pass, and aletheia is the understanding of how truth about adverbs come to pass, where aletheia is more of the process of realization and of the co-arising and emergence of a truth that was maybe there all along but couldn't be immediately pointed to or defined. It's also connected with Heidegger and phenomenology, where all of a sudden it's when we're paying close attention to our deep relationality to things psychically and physically that we can have truth transpire from our attention. I think it might just be a helpful way of seeing aletheia as the arising through the adverbial quality, and veritas meaning more about how we coordinate with nouns, and also hearing from that Aristotle tends to side himself to the veritas of truth, and that he would say things like good and evil are adverbs and therefore lesser compared to like people and cities, which are real concrete things. It's interesting, like, and it's an interesting question to Aristotle of would he see love or good, the good, as more fundamentally as an noun or adverb, or even just
I really like that distinction and breakdown of associating one with the noun and one with the adverb. I think it fits perfectly well. And I would even, with the amount of emphasis and oomph that Aristotle places on virtue, and how germane that is to character development and how important that is to the human flourishing life, and how I would associate all of those Aristotelianisms, if you will, more with the addition by subtraction we spoke of in the first half of the series, and that more readily to truth as aletheia than you would with veritas, because veritas feels more like addition by addition, something that's more just, it's present at hand. It's just there. It's there for you to see. And if you can see it, you can believe it. And if you can believe it, you can, there's just like a lack of argumentation there. And it's strange. Like truth as aletheia feels more Platonic in the dialectical sense of new possibilities emerging through adjacent possibilities, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like I wonder if almost like Platonic, the Republic or his theory of the forms is actually better put into discourse with Aristotle's ethics or de anima rather than metaphysics. Like metaphysics might be where Aristotle is genuinely being original and new in a way that hadn't been done at all before, and that it's almost a more difficult comparison to compare the metaphysics to something like
Certainly.
Plato's ontology, because there was such wide difference. Like Aristotle is going to very fundamental 0, whereas Plato is still in that realm of transformation. And so, almost like for Aristotle to look at how his discourse is playing out there, you'd look to his ethics, and you'd look to his golden mean, which is almost that relational determination of what's real and true and virtuous, rather than something that is like predetermined or easy to determine, or is well known. It's often found in that kind of in that flight or that correct correspondence to different poles that virtue starts to arise. I think as well, part of it, what's helpful about giving certain, like just bringing different word classes to frame is interesting, and I think it is a helpful scheme to get us closer to the metaphysical, because it is a category that we are so presumptive of. We have to, like, we can only think by the categories of adverbs and verbs, and they're universal. Every language has those distinctions to talk and to appeal to intelligibility. There's conditions to appeal to intelligibility, and when you question those conditions, you get this metaphysical question of, like, what is the intelligible? What are we talking about? And so, although there's a lot of merit for this exercise, looking at metaphysics through linguistic categories, I think there's a lot to doing it that stands on itself, but I'm not trying to overtly make that claim. I'm also just using this playfully to help us kind of feel into what Aristotle is saying here, and how we can think about him.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm hearing, that the metaphysics isn't as close a parallel to even, say, the art of rhetoric or the way he treats, de anima, and contrasting that more fairly and freely with Plato's works, because of the form in which they're presented and narrativized and treated. But I think that also Aristotle addresses in the Ethics himself, with the same old precision versus imprecision of the field and the remit of the field. And I guess I'm hearing that you're saying that metaphysics is more in the informative layer than the transformative, but you're also conferring onto Aristotle that it may necessarily be that way, because also this is like the first official account of our metaphysics, right? Which is very
exactly, that it's just a different categorical imperative that he's operating from.
And it's not to be confused with no one before him thought about these things. He's answering and addressing and retracting, and he's doing all sorts of verbs.
And what's so spectacular is that they all have these adjacent possibles that are in the spaces of each other, that they do sing together in chorus and in harmony. And so although the comparison essentially is not the same, the non-essential parts of it, which actually happen to be the transformative limits of something, totally overlap, and you get these adjacent possibles where when you've denoted one thing, what are the things that it connotes, what are the things that it connotates, and is that it implies, rather than specific reference, it implies it. Look at all the implications of these two sets and look at the spheres of overlap, and this is what you produce. Like, it's such a fruitful series to, even though it's not completely like for like, and we've known that, there's still so many different enormous, again, philosophical categoricals, disjunctions that we can explore.
Yeah, Kant is famously the grand synthesizer. Aristotle is also attempting a one-stop shop, right? And that's what his metaphysics is, and it's to be treated as such, where it's a coalescence of adjacent possibilities, concretizing and crystallizing into a form that for now is informative and just needs be, needs must. I
It's a
don't think
question.
that I don't think that there's any lack of. The more I read into him and study him, and expand my knowledge of his various works in his catalog, the more I realize he's not as dry and arid as I myself thought him to be 6 months ago. And I think we've been on this journey very much in the same vein together. Yeah, and the regard for him, in my estimation, keeps on rising in that specific domain as well. What would you say yourself as to how you categorize the different forms of truth and how Aristotle is engaging in them? Is it sort of a overlapping answer there?
Yeah, definitely like a both and kind of response. Like I can appreciate where we go in each of those lines of one wanting to think of truth more in that transformative capacity, and then the other wanting to think of truth more in the accordance with what is, without considering the subject. I think we've historically always had science that confirms the subject and had science that negates the subject, and they have always been the same science. So in a way, there's a non-essentiality which overrides them all, where although at a base we might be talking about fundamentally different things, the products and predictions and offshoots of it that we can learn and study and interact with do harmonize and intersect and overlap. So I'd be saying there's more of a connection between these areas than a difference, although when you really boil it down and look at them, there is quite a big difference between like the subjects. So again, a little bit of that multivalence that comes and sits quite closely together. I think that's all I'll say for now.
Yeah, I see all of that. And I think that what you were saying there was felt and kind of scattered and permeated throughout the preceding 19 discussions as well. Shall we soldier on then?
Yeah, I'd love to hear a next riff from you, from you on you.
How delightful. It's nice when things work out, isn't it?
Isn't it just?
Yeah, I mean, then in New 2, Aristotle, we don't have to go as linearly as this, but just to quickly breeze over it, he goes over number stuff even more and just gives us another, what he thinks is a new proof as to why numbers aren't eternal. He says it would be possible for them to not exist. And basically the summary of it is whatever admits of the possibility of non-existence cannot be eternal. I don't think that the people in the academy are saying that numbers are eternal in the way that Aristotle is understanding here. So I think he actually might be mistaken, sorry to say, or he's kind of seems to be straw manning their take on I think he's almost mixing up eternality with immutability somehow. But yeah, I don't know that. I haven't seen any other literature on that, so I could be as wrong as Aristotle there. But yeah, his argument is basically just that anything that has elements must also have matter, and nothing that has matter can be eternal, as he demonstrated rather eloquently with his actus purus, of course. Yeah, and then he moves on to, this will bode well with this. So he basically he gives us a nod to the Parmenidean one. I don't know how to say this word. Their grundprincip was that all things would be one, the existent itself. So yeah, famously the early crisis in Greek time in that period and in the zeitgeist was that being is what is, because that is what, kind of intuitively what is being, and being is what is. And so what isn't is non-being. And so following on from that in philosophy and in the entire tradition and lineage, we've been trying to figure out how we get multiplicity from unity. And we've had back and forths in different verbiage and phraseologies regarding this very topic. But one answer is that people posit that non-being exists and exists as difference. So the new word that I learned, what was it? Fuck, I've forgotten it. What was it?
Apophatic.
Apophatic. So yeah, it exists fundamentally to be explained through its difference and negation, and that's why we have non-being, and that's why it is essential, not essential the way being is, but essential categorically in its existence. And then I quote Aristotle, they thought it was imperative to show that the non-being is. In this way, assuming pluralism, entities were to have their being from the being and something else. So yeah, he's basically questioning that initial presumption from the Parmenidean school, and he answers that, yeah, kind of eternal perennial question of the many. Like, assuming that's even a question, like I don't know what trips people up about there being many, but whatever. He answers that trippy question of why there is many, or why things present themselves in multiples, by saying that things become many because many substances exist. And we obviously see this in the last three or four chapters, where he's talking about the different ways we approach the idea of substance, what their true nature is, how we can kind of zero in on what is and understand it through a process of elimination. And what we're left with at the tail end of that is substance. Necessarily, it's something that's definite, mutable, it has all the properties, the essential properties that he demarcates in the previous chapters. So manyness exists because many substances exist, but the reason that things differ is because those very substances in their multitude or in their multiplicity possess different forms. And that's the Aristotelian smuggling in that he always does, right? That's kind of his answer. So it's not that there was a one and then now there's a many, and how do we get to the many? It's that plurality is baked into reality from the beginning because many substances exist. So plurality isn't one plus non-being. One plus non-being does not equal plurality. At the start, God created the world in 7 days, and at that time there was plurality. And this also like kind of ties in perfectly with the opening lines that we've discussed before from the Tractatus, right? The world is all that there is, but what the world is the totality of the possible states of affairs. And there's kind of a deliberate, I want to say, absconding of the temporal layer there. It's just the world is all that there is, and it's the possible state of affairs. It's baked into it. Yeah,
fantastic. I like what you're picking up on there at the end, is like how Aristotle's zero, his priors, his starting point is just fundamentally different from the Platonists and from the Neoplatonists. And when you look at Plotinus, one of the things that he struggled to answer and couldn't quite answer in a way is why the good or the one ever emanates. If it's so good and perfect, why refract and diffract and detract into this earth, when if you just have your, if you're just an unmoved move, if you just have your perfection, then why would it be extending into the non-perfect? And it does leave you with some difficulties. And the Gnostics had an explanation for it, and they valued or put good and evil in the same ontological status, and then that leads to all sorts of problems and is also psychologically very unhealthy in a way, although it's addictive. I feel like it helpfully shows the key differences between Plato and Aristotle, and what you're saying. Like, I think it's very palatable what those differences are. It's quite funny. We had Aristotle, Plato smuggling, all to get Jordan Peterson, Jesus smuggling 2,000 years later.
Absolutely. I mean, the question of why is a bit troubling for me there too, to go right back to the beginning of this series. Why does why does anything that is pure actuality feel the need to emanate? It doesn't feel a need. There is no why. It emanates,
Yes, it's pure actuality. There's no question. There's no choice there. You're trying to put choice in a place where there is just pure discernment and decision. There's just pure action. There's no
superimposition, right?
Yeah. So why do humans, choose to walk upright? And of course, there's biological reason, but it's also like, what are you talking about? Like, why do humans choose to be alive? It's like that is what's about the nature of a human, like, is to the bipedal animal. Hello, the thing is to stand on two legs. You don't question. There's no agency or choice there, as we were saying before about the rational and non-rational potentials. There's some which are just determined, and others which are chosen. And as we explored in the hero, like, there's always a mix, and they start to entwine. And if you have like the rational and the non-rational on a plane, then the hero is kind of where it's folded over, and you have this, pencil through it. You have both of them in one, close together but still distinct. I think like that starting point of even Plato having this grand ontology where he gets to the one and he gets to this emanation and participatory metaphysic, which I think like participation in higher forms as a frame is based, like it's grounded, it's reasonable, it's pretty true to a number of instances across science and logic and even virtues.
Aristotle grants that, right?
Yes, and Aristotle, he grants it, but he does think of it as a bit flimsy from Plato. He's a little bit critical of this. Okay, how does it participate? Like, what are we actually talking about here? And Plato just didn't develop that. Aristotle does give us this more formed account of how something would participate by breaking it into the potential and the actual, that form matter distinction, and talk about the interpenetration through that way, localizing forms rather than keeping them abstract. But yeah, just the starting point of like, yes, Aristotle has an unmoved mover, but that's a little bit of just the life force and energy, and he doesn't need a cosmological order for how all things come from that. He just says like, this is the center of the universe, it's everywhere, and it moves itself and it moves all things, but it is, it's not like some singular localized force or place. Like he doesn't geographize it like Plato does. Plato puts it in a new dimension, puts it in some existing place, and then he has to create numbers to exist there as well, creates forms to live there. But for Aristotle, it's just like heaven is spread across the face of the earth, but men do not see it. Like I get that vibe a bit more from Aristotle, where it is just the vertical dimension, and it's the adjacent possible that's always present in anything that has substance, is this prime substance which is causing its motion. And to finish my point, it's a little bit of that plurality that Aristotle points to is the fundamental basis, right? In these substances that have no deeper prior. I think that's why you get Aristotle making the arguments that he is, and you can almost just see the different temperament that he has, and where that all comes from. And it's a little bit why he's tentative to give ontological status to the one, and he says like, the one is, the first thing for us to then start counting and count up. So yeah, there's this, I think Aristotle gives us a greater mode to hold different pluralities together, rather than looking to ascend to like this deeper non-dual unity. So Aristotle gives us the duality and non-dual, and Plato gives us the non and non-dual.
It's a little bit mystifying, because Aristotle almost seems a bit more magical than Plato when he decides to purposefully leave it locationless, right? You think, wait, isn't it less magical to just say it's not here, but it's at least somewhere? And to say that it's not here is to state and to assert something powerfully, which is your job, Aristotle, that it's somewhere. Just because you can't.
And interesting as well, like if you think about the canvases that each of them use to locate the topology of their God, in a sense, Plato is using the day and using lightness and illumination to represent it. And he says the sun is the entity that, by analogy, we can understand the one. It's this illuminating force that gives light to everything. That's why all things participate in the good, because all things are energized by and depend on the good for their own life and existence. But Aristotle uses the nighttime. He uses the stars, and he says, look at these spheres. These are the heavens. Look at them all moving around according to their own unique math and science. So what I'm saying is Plato must have been a Leo and Aristotle an Aquarius. No, but I think there's something interesting and instrumental about that. Even just the types of instruments that they're playing and the songs that are coming from their work. But yeah, Aristotle is placing it more And he begins by thinking, okay, there must be 52 unmoved movers. Like, he's kind of fine to be like, there's one or there's a lot. Like, it's neither here nor there. It's
Yeah. And he's not being circuitous. He's not being, ambiguous or obfuscating what he deems to be the truth, like for the way Foucault would, I think he
yeah, he's being
genuinely just,
rational.
deeply rational, and he's very comfortable in that insinuation of being called that too. And I mean, this part is rather convoluted, but he kind of says that, even because you were mentioning the Neoplatonists as well, and we've talked about the little bit of a revival in Platonic forms, even through dovetailing fields such as the morphic resonance idea that you told me about through Michael Levin, and how there seems to be a sort of newfound understanding of the world of abstraction as it pertains to even the human body and the way that we cognize and store data and information within ourselves, and in that general world. And Aristotle kind of said he's puzzled by the newer academics who reject the forms in that little middle period before this late revival, who reject the proper or the truer understanding of Plato's forms, but still accept that those objects abstractly exist independently, because he thinks if you've removed them from their form, that's a troubling word, if you've removed them from their place of the explanatory power and prowess, what use is there? Like, he can almost grant that Plato makes more sense than the Neoplatonists who supposedly carried the baton further. If the forms are even theoretically causal to particulars, then it's like, okay, you're wrong, but I can understand from Aristotle. But if you're just disregarding them or relinquishing them entirely, that makes no sense, because for him, those objects that exist either they reverberate throughout, they exist ubiquitously. Those forms simply describe the features of reality that are describable. And so they have a place. It's like what we said at the start about real, abstract, real. The features of reality that are quantitative, they quantitatively describe fittedness. But what about the ones that just aren't? And it's funny because paradoxically, Aristotle's the one that rightly gets accused for not accounting for fringe cases, but he's saying that back.
Yeah. And I think the thing that sort of befalls Aristotle, and why, because Aristotle is opening up Plato and trying to broaden and be more expansive and more kind of graspable according to his substance ontology, but it's almost like you couldn't push that substance ontology too much further. You need a qualitative difference, and it's like where the Neoplatonist goes, you then need a relational ontology. And I think it's that qualitative shift which opens up a new dimension of multivalence to our metaphysical world and our understanding. And it means that, okay, we now have Aristotle and his truth sitting here, and now we have this deeper, like, relational way to think and feel about things and look at the adverbial qualities, and that sits here, and these need to sit together and talk to each other. But that's a little bit of where Aristotle then runs into a limit that a lot of people would, that Neoplatonist would say he needed to evolve further, and that was to say that you can't actually do that calculus of being, because there's something so, even to specify and to have words and to have language from the first place, even before the categories of nouns and adverbs, to define anything from the start is to define it in relation to something else, to give it a quality such that we can know it. And so what Aristotle would say is non-essential about things is actually necessary to define anything in the first place. And so you get this line of argumentation from James Fuller, where relationality is what becomes prior. And it was part of what I had called out when looking at our definitions of unity. For me, the one thing that I wanted to look into and hear from Aristotle was like difference as just the fundamentals of unity. And it's that kind of area where then we're able to develop Aristotle further. But I think as well, like it's not just Platonism. It has to become Neoplatonism. It has to evolve to take into account the contribution Aristotle made. Aristotle like made this collision which changed the course of history, and you can't forget Aristotle for that. You have to see him in the roots of the way that intellectual thought has gone, and yeah, it's fruitful to revive that and to more closely examine what Aristotle really contributed to that.
Yeah, that last point is worth mentioning as well, because much of him is rubbished away as being apocryphal. And we also didn't mention the Islamic world's, the influence he had on the Islamic world, of course, and the way that they would assimilate the new informative language from him would have been like just indescribably different.
Even greater influence on the Islamic world than the Christian world, because it was the Islamic intellectuals in that tradition that preserved Aristotle for hundreds of years. There was no other, well, in Plato as well, but definitely Aristotle, that it was preserved through their keeping and transcribing and translating that kept Aristotle alive, and is the reason that we have him today. And so you just have scholar after scholar that read and learned and theologized and philosophized through Aristotle.
One of the pre-Renaissance strongholds of where his library of works most pervaded was Constantinople, and you just wonder how much of that would have lasted and had this repeatedly redolent effect on society. Like, it seems like Aristotle comes out of the blue every 50 years, and how much of that could have been possible without the Byzantine people's work there, whatever they did. No, that's great stuff. Anything else on that before we move on?
Nah, good to progress.
Cool. Still just going semi-linearly throughout the news. I felt that in the sort of middle chapters there wasn't too much that was new, but like I said near the beginning, I found his writing style, just his general attitude and prose, really, really enjoyable. And I even want to say playfully postmodern. He was kind of just dancing in the ruins and like playing with fire and stuff. Even the adjectives he used, the structure, it was a dear diary of complaints and going ad hominem where perhaps it was uncalled for. I wrote down two phrases. He wrote long story and no labor for. So he was just making fun of philosophers I personally haven't even heard of that he's read inside out. And that was pretty cool. He just also has announced, given that this wasn't presented in a purposefully palatable form that was to be publicized, he seems to have an outstanding command of the written word. And for those people that wish to exalt and uphold the sanctity of the written word, he's a great exemplar for that. He just knows every word in which to call upon. There's some philosophers and some writers throughout the Western canon that have this uncanny grasp of not being obtuse and not being lucid where possible without being reductive or without reducing any of the necessary detail, and being as taking the long road where needed, not doing so where needed, and again, fittedness even in the way that you present your ideas.
Yeah. It's interesting to pick up on that, as like Aristotle is the postmodern philosopher, or like not as a identity descriptor, but as that quality of him being everywhere and nowhere. Like, we'd picked up on that 5, 6, 7 episodes ago, and it's like, yeah, he does shop in many ways, and he has things to say, and he'll critique Plato, and then smuggle him in, and he'll critique. And it's not like he's doing it in bad faith. He's doing it in good faith, which is what makes him an admirable postmodernist. Much unlike the others.
He's the philosopher of fittedness, but also of expedience. Whatever is required, he will do, and he will bend over in the shape that is needed. So he makes sure he fits as well.
Yeah, and I think, like, even just to spend a little bit of time here, partly in something that I've been inspired to bring to light, which is a bit more of that Hegelian reading of Aristotle. Hegel, when he taught lectures on the history of philosophy, spent a lot of time discussing Aristotle. And for Hegel, Aristotle was like kind of one of the first modern thinkers as well. So even before that post-modernity, which Aristotle extends to, he also has this modernity where he comes from this lineage of the birthplace of thought, is what Hegel calls it. Hegel has all these wonderful descriptors and can just make philosophy seem like the golden horizon that human consciousness rides on, and it's beautiful. But yeah, like to quote Hegel, or to quote someone who read both Hegel and Aristotle, Bernard Bourgeois, French, he said, comparing the thinkers from the start, the same unity of empirical intuition and rational concept was present there. So the reconciliation of the exploration of multiform reality and the conceptual determination of this reality. So the ways in which, like, it's partly in that you see Aristotle as this postmodern and modern thinker, where you can explore the multiform reality and you can have the conceptual determination, and then you also get this reconciliation between them. So to reconcile, and I bet you concile means something close to having your hands in prayer. But yeah, like really Aristotle saw Hegel as this first Greek thinker who, out of this cradle of human consciousness that was liberated from religious thinking, so could be truly free, out of these pre-Socratics and from Thales to Parmenides to Heraclitus, Aristotle changes the tune of thought, and partly from his determination of essence, the essence of the unmoved mover as pure actuality, interjects this new kind of dynamism to substance. It creates this identity that through change persists in its identity. We saw and talked about before how Heraclitus had this understanding of change where identity wasn't preserved, and that Plato had this, he didn't have an understanding of change. He only had this, like, the eternal is the more real. But Aristotle is the first to actually go, no, change is fundamental into the being of things, and it's through change identity is preserved, and through like self-determination there is like activity innately woven in that. And so I think all in all, to say that Aristotle has very high praise and sees Aristotle as a completely modern thinker for the way that he can bring such unique and different concepts to life, survey the field, look at the philosophers before him, literally go out into the field and make observations, zoological and botanical, and then bring it back to these ideas that leverage all that he's learned and offer a more penetrating way to see things. Like what he's denoting is like amazing, but what he also implies is like this spotlight, this halo, that just opens into so many more domains. And so there's this originative seed in Aristotle that Hegel saw and thought was an absolute marvel. And then the products of that seed, the adjacent possibilities, as we're discovering in the series, open us up to so many different spaces and ranges of discussions, and all comes back to Aristotle. And I think that is the kind of the logical calculus of Aristotle, is that it can all come back to this metaphysical scheme. And it is, it's just something to meditate on at the end of the day.
Very well put, man. Storyteller extraordinaire, as I always say to you. Yeah, he's obviously the famous proto-philosopher, proto-scientist, proto-zoologist, proto-this and that. He's also rightly dubbed proto-philosopher in a different way, not just in the sense that he had a wide-spanning and sprawling set of works in his catalog, but also that I almost feel like he was the perfect predisposition and to be the first proper philosopher, because part of that's not even in your hands. It's just a more, well, there's the anecdotal side of it. There's the lived reality, the first-hand experience side of things that primed him. He was famously an elitist who believed that the ideal life is one of the perfect proportion of contemplation, engagement, and friendships, for example, and how all of these cohere and co-constitute what we can move towards now, which is the good life and what that looks like, and maybe personal musings on that. But for that, you need to have not only the right hereditary capacity and influence, but also you need to have the right amount of wealth. For example, external circumstances need to meet the condition to philosophize. And Aristotle sits in this weird eclectic brand of people in the history of human life that seem to be this lightning in a bottle type thing, where he was the right person with the right brain power, with the right amount of desire to exercise the faculties bestowed upon him generously. You know, it almost feels like there's like 6 or 7 variables there, and most people at best get given 3 or 4, and they strive to their utmost, and they end up being 10% of what Aristotle was in terms of the contributions made to mankind. So yeah, I also just want to appeal to him as a man and how that perfectly poised him to be a philosopher, which is kind of also where we started this. You know, philosophy is physiology. He was also a healthy gay man, we would say today, but I guess the word gay did not exist back then in this way.
He would be so gay today, wouldn't he?
He would be an absolute fairy princess. Yeah. Yeah, no. So that I fully get everything you're saying, and you would almost, in his world, in the ideal life, the person reading his work but also writing works would be somewhere between a scientist and a mathematician and a philosopher, just a consciousness explorer in general, which I think is the perfect foray into what we were going to talk about in terms of goodness as a category and how important that is for Aristotle as well as for us. I know personally, I just want to pay a bit of homage to the middle chapters before we get into a bit more of a personal back and forth. I found it new 4 and 5 to be very evocative and suggestive of the types of things that I'm really into at a personal level. There's a trail that draws us back to the inception of metaphysics, not just the book, but the idea and the study. And yeah, like I said, consciousness exploration more widely. I think there's but all men by nature desire to know. There's a deep faith of the eternal promise, the ontological good, of there being some sort of connection, deep rooted connection between our understanding of reality and reality itself, and we happily confabulate these two things, and we have no problem in some conjectures more than others. Something that goes hand in hand with that is that being with a capital B itself is illuminated by the good, and that seems to me to be the perfect bridge where the thing that shines the sunshine and the ray and the light onto being is the good. And for that reason, I guess you could say that the form of the good, if you will, stands above all forms in a very, of course, in an intertwined sense, but also in a standalone sense. So it would be deeply problematic for us and our modern sensibilities if we were to suddenly learn that the good has nothing to do with first principles and only arises later, which Aristotle addresses in these middle chapters. He talks about, let me find it. He talks about a sudden appeal to mythology to guide our deep intuition. So we obviously have a set of sensibilities that add up to form what we call intuition. And then, like more widely speaking, a recurring trope in Greek tradition seems to be that cosmic, say, or natural elements, water, earth, fire, but then even more than that, just primordial matter or primordial entities, concepts like night, the night sky, heaven, chaos, and ocean is what he writes. They're not good or beautiful. They're simply first conditions. So I think it's pretty well understood in Greek world history that these things are actually first conditions. Then they're quite virginal when left untouched and unfettered. There's no innate goodness until the humans imbue what they will onto it. And you see this in Hesiod, in Homer, in all the plays and the protagonists in all these great stories. Even the Bacchae and Euripides, you see that it's only after deliberate human intervention from a human that has worked on his character, that is virtuous therefrom, that these things that in their primordial untouched state are just neutral, you could say, suddenly get charged with something positive. And so, yeah, things like divine order, the type we are infatuated by and we succumb to in its most sublime forms, harmony, whether it's harmony, musically, as Pythagoras points out, and the relationship that has to the heavens, or anything that we categorize as having sublimity and under the category of beauty, these things only emerge later for the traditional average ancient Greek person. The phrase that Aristotle uses is Johnny come lately Zeus. So it's post prolonged, there's some sort of cosmic strife that's taking place in the world. The fate of the world hangs in balance, a la the monomythic structure, and it's post that prolonged battle that wages on, that we finally have goodness. So goodness doesn't seem to be an innate condition for Greek man. So I wonder if that's a nice starting point, and we could also just back and forth on how much we agree on that as a backdrop versus any new thoughts that emerge.
Yeah, the thought that was lingering for me at the end was, and using like Aristotle and Plato as potentially having different starting points for it, or different answers, and then we can kind of riff on it ourselves, is the origin of goodness. And is that something that's discovered or created? No, is it something that we learn over time and have a greater sense for it through action and like through real contact with the world? Or is there some preconditioned idea of goodness that we then come to learn about its existence? Like, is it bottom up or top down in a way? And I'd be curious even to drop into, like, ask a question more personally towards you. In knowing what Aristotle is saying there, and how goodness is something that our rationality and our souls are able to sort of overlay and then prescribe to different things as we've seen and come to learn about them. Where do you see the ontological status of goodness? But and what center of gravity does goodness and its historical development have? Is the historical development of the good primary, or is there more a truth to the good that you feel it is situated more within? Is this a helpful distinction to ask even, or is there a deeper synthesis you'd try and pull us towards when thinking about the good and by extension the good life? But let's just go for the good first. Let's come to the good life after, but let's just consider the good for a moment.
Yeah, tremendous question. So much there and so packed. It's impossible to not invoke the true and the beautiful when thinking of the good, almost by difference and deference, as Derrida would say. So it's, there's some sort of a unity even in the difference there for sure. Personally, I had a real awakening earlier this year where, so I was really troubled by the fact, I asked a really close friend of mine what he would most associate me with, the true, the good, or the beautiful. You just have to choose one. It's multi-choice. There is no right answer, but the only wrong answer is that you don't choose. And he said, 3 years ago, he said true. And I said, damn it. And that's quite telling. I thought, why am I so disappointed to hear that? And then about a year later, he said, the beautiful. And I thought, oh, damn it. Okay, that's a bit better, but damn it. And then, this month, he said the good. And that's exactly what I wanted to be most associated with. And I thought, okay, there's a lot of material here for me to explore and introspect and opine on as well. So I went down the rabbit hole of my own mind and I started thinking about it. And I think because I associate the pneuma that I want my spirit to be most attached with is that of controlled power and one of healthy hierarchy. And what that means would be some sort of a dynamism that allows for volition and control that actually doesn't allow for the Dionysian flood as much as you might think, knowing me a little bit. but the concept of unity that I could most happily attach to as it pertains to controlled power and how that animates my spirit so much and vitalizes me and makes me feel healthy and strong and striving and ambitious would be that of the good. And that's because I'm not talking about the moral good, obviously, when that's not really what we mean, or that's not solely what we mean. I'm talking more of eternal righteousness, and I'm therefore talking more about dharma, the restoration of order, the restoration of things to a world balance, not in the sense of exactitude, but in the sense of harmony. So it's more of a, if you will, a circle of life, Lion King type thing of, no, there is a hierarchy and the apex predator sits atop that, and it's my job, it's my to incorporate the normative axis, it's my ethical duty, even perhaps deontologically, to make sure that that is restored and that there is a cosmic balance as I deem fit. So there's a deep perspectivism running through all of this as well. None of this is to be treated dryly objectively. And I think if I was planning the perfect state, a la Plato and the Republic, it would be something like everyone being an automaton that's, well, that sounds cheap, but everyone doing their own version of this, essentially. And the way, yeah, and just another tangent on the good as well. No, it slipped my mind. I can leave that there. And then if it comes back, I'll say it.
Well, genuinely, what I was hearing there, and I made two separate connections back to Thin Lizzy, so I'm just going to draw them both together here. But it seemed like the good was just the fattest concept for you. That, like, the truth, okay, yeah, it's one of the three transcendentals, like, it's pretty special. And then the beautiful as well is, like, hands down what, beauty is, the initial present scene and appearances of something to come. Like, it always strikes you in beauty, and that prepares you for the good. But the good as something that you wanted to find, you were more ready to find a attachment with or connection to. That was the center that held more weight out of those transcendentals. And to me, it was like, okay, you can account for more, you can feel more fitted to it because you feel like there's a wider base to offer a balance to. And even through the different traditions and your reference of like Hindu culture, as some of the descriptors from that is a more balanced way, and it's not leaning too much into either direction, but is trying to do the kind of the whole coordination from it. And so, the other connection that I had separately was like, like the good life is about, getting on Thick Lizzie's back and letting that donkey ride where it's going to, and being there for the ride. So allowing yourself to not always have to be in control. Like, spoiler alert or not, I don't know. No, it's not a spoiler. It's just part of a common myth. The Odyssey, the Odyssey, part of the great realization of the hero Odysseus in that movie is that he has to give up his desire to be the witted one, to have all the cunning and the smarts, or have the strength and the courage and fortuitousness. He's told through this nymph that is kind of partly keeping him held captive in a dream. So to wake up from his fantasy, he has to submerge himself, to go home, he has to submerge himself and basically let go of his always wanting to be in control, like always having to have an explanation or have a plan or be cunning in some way, that actually to kind of sacrifice and give yourself up to something beyond you, getting on top of Thin Lizzy, like that is what takes you home. So as long as you can entrust Thick Lizzy to trot along, then it'll trot you home. It'll trot Jesus back into Bethlehem, back into Jerusalem. And it's a little bit of, okay, the good is something you can entrust with your life, more so than truth and beauty, because they have particular almost specialties. Like you could almost see them as a trinity, but it's like the good and then the true and the beautiful, where they are a unity altogether, but the good just seems to have almost more of that personal care, and we as humans are looking for some personage in what we are seeing as ultimate. Yeah.
That's beautiful and gives me a lot of fuel for what I was actually trying to say. And yeah, that's amazing, man. I think the good feels like it permits and admits of more of me, and it allows for a type of selflessness that I'm very hesitant of when it requires self-sacrifice, because the last thing I need is to lose autonomy or volition, and that's how people feel backed into a corner. You know, when you talk about selfishness versus selflessness, and whether that's a polarity with tension inherent in it or not. I think the good is the one category I can safely leave my ego under and say, yeah, I'm happy to be the kind of selfless that this requires of me, knowing full well it doesn't take away from me, because it's the type of juxtaposition that affords. All of them have an innate juxtapositionary capacity. Of course, there is a deep juxtaposition even in the true. And we started a lot of this series by talking about the paradoxes, innate to life, our experience of reality, and how philosophy is the wondrous journey that allows you to pick up, carry, augment, consolidate more and more aspects and amounts, like the quantums of paradoxes, alongside the ascent up the mountain with you. So seeing that is somehow baked into the very nature and fabric of things, I think the good is the one that I would categorize as being most kind and forgiving and magnanimous as a category to the young striving man. And of course, same question to you, but if you wanted to respond to that first, that'd be great.
Firstly, just to check, is my picture and sound still synced up? Because you have a little bit of delay. I'm hearing you, but then your picture is probably like 1 second delayed.
Yeah, that's because I moved, and let me just try one thing.
I could potentially leave and then rejoin.
No, that's because of my laptop thing. I don't know what's happening. If you leave and rejoin, that doesn't affect the recording, right?
I think it stays, like you've left and rejoined before and it preserved.
Okay, can you do that then? I think it's purely on my end. We might just have to persevere with this.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, let's persevere. Well, all systems are go. I can take this up. Yeah, I'm gonna potentially venture to a slightly different angle for answering it, and it was in the question from the start, which was a polyvalent question. But one of the strands that I'm perhaps drawn to, almost addressing a little bit, is whether the good is something that we come to learn and is kind of over time something we can have a greater grasp over, or whether it is something that is pre-existent and giving us our life and our source. And I think really the task there is just to understand the A-B-ness of it, and understand like kind of the properties and attributes. Or even if we put it back to Aristotle, and what if we said that there was a pure actual, a pure form, and also a pure material and a pure potential? Like, what if this life has had to have an originator, a starter, something that kind of switches on this existence-ness rather than non-existence, but then through deeper living and greater expansion of our horizons, do we come to have an ever more clear picture of it? And I'm not sure if Aristotle would disagree with any of this, but I think it is. I'm using his framework to answer this question. So, yeah, this is again like one of those adjacent possible spaces where you can take something like the understanding. You can take the calculus of Aristotle and use it to address and respond to some of the deepest metaphysics today and some of the deepest kind of ethical questions today. I think that frame's good. It gives me that fittedness of having the form itself, so knowing the good when I see it, and my ancestors knowing the good when they saw it, and constantly striving towards that. I'm constantly striving to support and care for and nurture what's there, but also be creative and generative and intuitive. So this sort of balancing of masculine and feminine energies in the way that the good is realized. And yet there's so much, even when I think about this personally and existentially, there's so much to the limits of my understanding, and there's so much beyond those limits that I'm discovering through my day to day, through this podcast. Like thinking about the way that this podcast has helped me to sensitize to the good as an actuality, as a form, but only through the cultivation of potential and matter. Has like my materiality been shifted? Have I sat down, week in, week out, and had the right nutrition and the right sleep, and channeled the things that have been in my body, channeling these memories of the Odyssey last night that kind of help slip in and fit into my prose and my pose and my poise. This ingestion process of these recaps that have been happening each week, and I just see that as this great and generative material that I have been able to grasp a wider base and have a more compelling and potent spiraling upwards. The last few episodes we talked about how there's a non-zero sum game of the spiral that takes place in life, and there's a spiraling up and out, or the spiraling in, and I think it's the potential of the good is to ascend on that spiral. And and the ascension is also just a deepening and a greater intimacy. And I think like this podcast has shown me more towards that sensitivity towards the good. And so, naturally, I want to say that, kind of coming back to the original question, the truth of the good, or the historical nature, I think the historicity is interwoven with the truth of it, and that history shows us the form of the truth in which it couldn't be another way, but that couldn't be known before we had this historical development. There's a co-realization, a co-emergence of some of these ideas, like the shunyata, the creative co-emergence between kind of oppositions of things. And so I think there's something there that should be embraced, like the learning through the living and the living through the learning, I think are equal parts embraceable, and areas that we have been kind of trying to lead by example, but also just experience by learning, just to see, to put ourselves out there and make a bunch of predictions, but also be open and willing to when things look and come to be a little bit different. But the shunyata is also that non-dual, right? It's a kind of emptiness, but it's an emptiness which a lot of form and independent existence comes to arise from. And it's again back to those relations as being really prescient and present in it. And so, it's that kind of quality of co-emergence which justifies my answer. And then my answer itself, I think, is only justified by my existentiality and authenticity, and that.
Yeah, is the shunyata the vacuous state that's at the beginning and the end of all scales? Is that what it's roughly equated to? Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and then all that's in between also kind of has arisen from this shunyata, this state of emptiness.
right. Yeah. The reason I ask is because when I was bringing up the zero a couple episodes ago, that's shunya as well, and that means both nothing and everything conveniently in Hindi. So that's kind of fortuitous and crack up. I'll just respond to what you said, and then we can close as well with some conclusive remarks to end both the discussion, our friendship, because we're not going to talk after this, and the series. The Delirious Boys have been have metamorphosed, if that's a word, from the Delirious Boys to the Poise Boys. That's perfect, man. I love it. Frolicking, bouncing turns of phrase has become your forte throughout the series. And like friend of the show, Anderson Todd, said once that in the Jungian model, the ego, what we colloquially assume and associate with simply our sense of self, is something like the address where you live. So it's not nothing, but it's not you. It's that which encases you, but is not fundamentally you in its entirety and exhaustively. And I particularly like your spiral heuristic that we kind of co-realized in preceding discussions, because there's a temptation to want to obviously adhere to your idea of sense of self or the ego and not understand that it's merely the address where you live, but it's actually the entirety of you, and place yourself as a scatter on a scatter plot of life. And I'm just this one scatter. And that's for like those intuitive people and capable, adept people that can even posit themselves as a scatter and life as a scatter plot. Most people don't even have the I want to say sagacity to assume that life is, if it were to be mapped, it would be closest to a scatter and not a bar graph or a pie chart. In the sense of the similitude and differences you will detect as you detect patterns throughout your waking sense experience. Everyone is different, but everyone is different in a different way. They're not merely different to you in the same way, operating on the same axis. And so to avoid combinatorial explosion, we have to have certain categorizations, and the best way to encapsulate all of that on a graph is through a scatter plot. But then you think, wait, even that does not suffice, because I'm not a scatter on a sprawling, widely encompassing scatter plot. I'm actually not a scatter, and it's not a scatter plot. It's something like a spiral. And I'm not a scatter on a spiral. I'm a spiral on a spiral. And you just think, actually, this is actually way more whack and crazy than I thought when I was born. Yeah.
It
something like a spiral on
it
a
was
map.
about the birds and bees. It was about something very whack.
The birds and bees are like on the spiral path, though. Like you're a spiral on a map of infinite recursion, and somewhere in there are birds and bees. But it's kind of like the address where you live. Like that cannot be the sole focus, man. Semen retention, boys.
This is, I think, like even in what you said, we know how we co-realized a concept like that, and just reflecting on this as one of the greatest exemplaries of co-realizing that this modern philosophical age has helped to inform. Like it's and I'm speaking obviously like from my soul, so it's a little bit about my soul as a confession rather than something else, but I can embrace and own that. But it feels, this has felt like a monumentous series, but also not just like, wow, hasn't it been great what I've been able to do and had so much fun with it, but just I want to also bring attention to the listeners of the intentional way that we have designed and done this series to be one of co-realization, one of deep dialogos, and one of not only like finding each other, but also finding like Aristotle and finding Hegel and Heidegger through the other. So that mediation of a dialectics between us that has led to so much of this discovery and putting it out. And now it just leaves the content in that form of listenership is the proper approach. So yeah, I'm proud of what we have done and maintained and sustained. And I think like an example of that spiraling is how long the episodes have just gradually been becoming, because we've just got into this natural rhythm of, okay, when we sit down and chat, we know we can, crack this chapter open and we can, spill it all out and yeah, put it all on the table that Aristotle made available. And yeah, really come to know what's there and do so in a way where we're holding our own space, but we're also like relying on the space that the other's holding for us, for our space to be present. So yeah, again, a polyvalent, non-dual duality between us. And I think it's, even just objectively, has been such a great demonstration of the proper philosophical mode.
Yes, and I feel fundamentally different, having undergone a transformation across the last 20 discussions with you. And it's perhaps perfectly apt that the one thing we didn't talk about today was the importance of friendship and the good life for Aristotle specifically. And the simple demarcation would just be friendships that are of pleasure, most bottomly, mediocrely of utility, and then thirdly and most atop the hierarchy of virtue. And that's very much what I think this series has embodied and what us two have been able to hold in terms of the energetic space for one another, the logistical space as well. There's a lot of communication and planning that goes into something like this. And yeah, I think you covered it well when you said that it's impressive not only that we had the idea for this, but to sustain it and to see it through, because seeing anything through, no matter how simple or complex, is definitely the hardest part of the respective venture that you begin. So yeah, I think the thing that I feel most different today than I did at episode 1 is simply the sensitizing to the correct sensibility that adds up to form the fitted temperament to do philosophy. And I think that I was on a certain trajectory and acclimatized path on day 1, and I've simply just course corrected to something that fits more with my own pneuma and vitality.
He discovered swimming and it changed his life.
I was trying not to address the elephant in the room, but that's definitely what did it, not talking to you.
Yeah, I think bringing happiness in as well, like in Aristotle's The Ethics, he basically, writes 1/5 of the book is about friendship. And so in the ethical life, in the state of reaching eudaimonia, that flourishing, which is human flourishing, or is translated as happiness for some people. I think it's for that human flourishing is embedded in these relational, in these friendships, in these relationships that are friends first. There's something really special about a friendship, as opposed to being in a sibling or a family unit or in a intimate relationship. Friends are otherwise can inspire so much and is I think really great to kind of be ending on that note, by just showing the power, right, showing the spirit that friendship can have, and that can start to ripple and spread out into the world. In some, like in the series, Luca, you completely have my respect, and I'm all open ears, and so are the listeners. What's next for you in your journey with this channel and with your intellectual career? Where would you like to go, and what's next that we can look forward to, and keep our eyes and ears out on what you're doing? What's what's to come, or what's the direction that you might hope to lead us to?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to answer that and plug myself. But just before that, a closing quote from the Ethics on Friendship. Yeah, that sounded needlessly sexual. But he talks about friendship as a necessity. He says, between friends, there is no need for justice, but people who are just still need the quality of friendship. And indeed, friendliness is considered to be justice in the fullest sense. And I think we are the emblems of this quote. And if we aren't, then Aristotle was just plain ipso facto by default wrong. So I think we've upheld what we strive to on day one, the promises we kept internal and externalized too. And I'm very proud of us for having done that. Thank you so much to the listeners as well for plowing along with us. And whether you were actively or passively following, it means a great deal. You've also witnessed the birth pangs of one of the greatest and biggest and most widely watched YouTube channels in the world to be. We're going places, people. We're going places, which leads me eloquently into what's upcoming. Firstly, we're going to do we'll do some sort of a, celebratory, commemorative recap discussion or some sort of content regarding this series to summarize it really nicely, not intellectually and not conceptually, but more at a personal level. So if you dream of inner access to the worlds of Luca, Teller, and Alex, stay tuned for that.
Because what's better than one recap per episode when you could do a 20 episode recap in one recap? So
and we
that's on the
promise
horizon.
that the recap won't be longer than the 20 episode series. We'll try and keep it to the length of like 15 episodes or something. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. We'll sit with the series. It's changed us irrevocably internally in a multitude of ways. And so we want to sit with the feeling and just let it wash over us and let the afterglow terminate. And then after that, we'll, sober up and we'll very dryly and aridly come back at it and state our reflections in the most boring way possible. What's next for me and the channel is many, many things. This is simply a documentation of my learning, first and foremost. And so this is not my life itself. I have my actual life outside of a screen, believe it or not. And then some of that filters through into what is on screen and available to be viewed and publicized by me. But yeah, my two main focuses will be about focusing on what are some of the greatest individual passages, excerpts, ideas in the history of Western and Eastern literature, psychology, history, theology, and there's a fifth one. I cannot remember it, neurology perhaps, but I need to decide on what the other branch of that will be. And I'm just going to give my interpretation and analysis and breakdown of certain highlights of, the Western world, predominantly for people that are speaking English. There will be parts of the channel but that will have a Hindi branch to it as well. And so sometimes I'll make the same video twice, once in English, once in Hindi. We're also moving towards catering towards a more Asian audience. And I will be doing a series on the greatest story ever told, by my estimation, called the Ramayana. The most expensive film in the history of India is releasing in November this year. And so I'll be doing a bunch of synchronized countdown episodes and video essays related to that. So stay tuned if you're interested on all things ancient India and how we have misused, misunderstood, misappropriated, misdirected our personal lives and strayed too far from where we should be as a country and as a civilization and as a people. And if you would like a messianic figure to lead you out of the dumps, subscribe. So yeah, plenty in the works. We're kind of expanding well out from philosophy into other annals of culture. It's going to be, not only just stuff that's not in English, it's going to be stuff that's more mainstream, more less informative and dense, more entertaining and higher production value. So we're upping the ante across the board and cross-culturally, I hope very soon, and across language, across mythoses as well. So stay tuned for all of that and more. Thank you so much for watching, and any last thoughts?
Yeah, well, considering we're not going to talk again after the series, it's been nice knowing you.
All good things come to an end, and this wasn't even good. See you, Alex.